Hi, it's Conor Svensson here, founder and CEO of Web3 Labs. This is a conversation I had with Marley Gray, Principal Architect for Carbon and ESG at Microsoft, and founder of the Interwork Alliance, part of the Global Blockchain Business Council. Marley is both a blockchain and enterprise veteran. He spent his first 15 years at Microsoft working with financial services firms, then in 2015 was responsible for putting a blockchain on the radar of Satya Nadella, the Microsoft CEO, and securing Microsoft's headline sponsorship of the Ethereum DevCon 1 conference in London. In our conversation, we go deeper into these earlier days of blockchain at Microsoft before discussing the Token Taxonomy Framework, which Marley created, and his current work, which is helping to support Microsoft's goals of becoming carbon negative by 2030. Marley's someone I've had the fortune of collaborating with on a number of occasions over the years, and I'm really happy to be sharing this conversation with you. It's awesome to have you here on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And so you've been very involved in the Web3 space for quite some time. And I'd imagine many of the people listening don't actually know how instrumental you were with making blockchain a thing at Microsoft in the early days, and also some of the things that Microsoft did with respect to the Ethereum ecosystem and helping stuff like DevCon 1 happen, get off the ground. All of this, I think, are really cool stories, and I think it would be great to start off with those early days.
Yeah, sure. Those were heady times. Back the summer of 2015, I think it was. Uh, the when right before or the day Frontier was actually released, I had found myself. I was living in Manhattan at the time in New York, and I was, you know, my family was out of town. I had the week to myself, and I ended up spending a full week running in the labs because I was, in charge of the innovation labs for financial services in our New York City sort of Times Square marquee location. So we had a lot of equipment, and so I found myself with extra time to play with it. And one of the things that I wanted to do is, I just dove head first, and there were multiple times when I went home just to shower to come back. But it's been a lot of time playing with the Frontier release and really diving into what the possibilities. The big thing for me at the time was the notion of smart contracts, and being in financial services for a long time, your familiarity with what Bitcoin was, and all the reasons why Bitcoin wouldn't be a thing, back in 2015 was, especially in the regulated space, was just, we're looking at where we are now. It's kind of funny, but at the time it was just like a joke. But anyway, I remember, really coming in and talking to people first in our New York offices and saying, this is going to be a thing. This is going to be big. And we had some customers that were picking up on it as well, coming in and wanting briefings. So I ended up doing lots of explainers and, trying to, and the best way I think to learn something is to try to teach other people about what that tech is all about. And I really cut my teeth there.
And they were asking about Ethereum specifically, or just smart contracts
Just
generally?
the smart little blockchain, smart contract. What is a blockchain? And I got pretty good at explaining it to like non-technical lines of business heads at these big investment banks, and I got sort of steeped into it, and I was like, there's lots of interest from customers, and the customers really want to like play with this tech, but they don't want to do it in public, right? They want to do it in private. And at the same time, we were just trying to get the cloud adoption going. And I saw this as like a great use case. And I was like, well, let me see if I can figure out a way to stand up a private network in a cloud, instance. And I remember banging my head against the Frontier release, trying to figure out how you could get a node not to just automatically join the network, right? To get it to like stop. And it was really hard at the time. I remember having to go through and figure out how you get two nodes to establish a private blockchain. It was very difficult. And at the same time, hooked up with Consensus out of Brooklyn, and they were just operating out of picnic tables at the time, and they're I don't know if they're still in the same location right off the I can't remember where exit it was, but anyway, so we spent a lot of time together, Andrew Keys and I, and the rest of the Joe Lubin and a lot of the other early guys at Consensus, and we sort of came up with this notion of, because I had enlisted some help, I was like, I need help getting this to work, and I want to stand this up. So we came up with the concept of Ethereum blockchain as a service, which was just how can you stand up a private network really quickly, spin it up, have it work, and then tear it down, play with it and do it all in private, do it fail fast, fail cheap kind of thing. And customers are really interested in doing that. So I spun up a couple of those with customers, and then I remember Andrew, was the one who sort of said, we need to do something, release this. And Azure was still early on, and I was like, well, let me see if I can figure out a way where we can put this in the Azure marketplace. So I went off and started talking to our teams and talking to people in Redmond. And I was like, well, there's this blockchain thing that's going to be pretty big. And everybody was like, block what? What are you talking about? I was like, surely somebody's, on top of this. And it's like, there's nobody. So I was like, okay, well, I don't know how this is going to work. So, we came up with the idea of, all right, let's see if we can package this thing up and script it and get it to show up in a marketplace and stand up. And we had this sort of test environment where we could write these, they were called ARM scripts at the time, Azure Resource Manager scripts, to automatically deploy these private networks. And we could put a little icon on there, and it looked neat. You could stand up this little like quick and dirty marketplace. So it worked, and I was like, okay, well, let's see if we can release this. And nobody was doing anything. And at the same time, Andrew had contacted, I can't remember who it was at the Wall Street Journal, and somehow grouped us into an interview like on a Monday morning in our offices. And I hadn't gotten approval for any of this stuff. I'm just a software architect running the innovation labs in New York and not associated with any product group. I'm just like hacking away. And I remember talking to my industry team, because I was in the financial service industry, and saying, hey, I got this interview with the Wall Street Journal on Monday, can I get some support? And they were like, wait, what? You can't do that. And I was like, I really couldn't say no. It just came out, and it's like, well, how? You're not supposed to do this. But it was Monday, and this was on a Friday, and because it was a journal, they weren't going to cancel, right? So it was sort of like, okay, we got to do this. So we announced with that, and we were saying we're putting Ethereum blockchain as a service, and we were going to release it at DevCon. And this was like 10 days before DevCon. And I remember I put in a request for like, God, I don't remember if it was like $7,000 or something to be a sponsor of DevCon, to try to get that. I couldn't get the money anywhere. Before then, I was like kicking and screaming. I was talking to every marketing person that I knew had budget, and I couldn't get the money. And right after that article, I got twice that amount. Right, that article came out. It says, well, it didn't come out. It was like after the interview, then people, gave me the money to fund DevCon 1 in London. And then I remember, it's like, oh, this is going to happen. We're going to do this. And I booked my airline ticket and flying over to London from New York. I hadn't done that in quite a while, so I was pretty excited about going on that trip. And they were going to have a local press liaison with me, because there's a lot of press at that event. I remember people were there, and so I had interviews lined up with a whole bunch of people, because it was like, I remember being there. The first thing people would ask is like, Microsoft, what are you doing here? And I was like, well, we're here, doing the cloud stuff, and we, talk about the enterprise use cases, and
you guys were like a headline sponsor at DevCon as well, weren't you?
We were. I remember I was up there, and I gave the Ethereum blockchain as a service thing, the pitch, and then I had interviews the rest of that day with like Reuters and I was like, man, this is huge. And I had like my friends in London that were with me, and they were like my partners in crime. And we went to go eat lunch at Canary Wharf at Love. Is it? I can't remember what it's called now. The Innovation Lab at Canary Wharf, level 46 or something.
Yeah. I know the one.
Anyway, so everybody was there, and we were there eating lunch and I was like, man, this is big. Why aren't we getting any traction on this thing? This is going to be a big thing. And I was crafting an email I was going to send to Satya, because Satya had just come the CEO, and he was talking about growth mindset. And I was like, this is a big thing. And they were like, dude, do not send that email. Do not send that email. And as I'm crafting it, because I was kind of pissed off. I had like worked my butt off, got all this stuff, got all this press done. And then an email comes in while I'm drafting it, and I look at it, and it was somebody from the industry team and said, "Is this you?" And it was a forward of a email that Sati had sent his leadership team, which is all the EVPs, and was saying, "This is the exact thing I'm talking about for growth mindset." It was a link to the Reuters, thing. And from that point forward, it was like full on, right? And I got pulled into Redmond to try to figure out where we were going to do blockchain, find a home for blockchain and our engineering teams. And that's how we ended up in Azure, starting the blockchain engineering team in 2016 and growing that team and sort of evolving it to where we're like, we call it sort of multi-party computing now. It's a whole sort of paradigm that sort of spans more than just blockchain. Blockchain is like a key ingredient, or distributed ledgers are key ingredients, or ledgers in general. But then you have lots of other capabilities that you want to surround with it that, round out a solution. So anyway, that's how we got started. It was a crazy time. It seems like a long, long time ago, but
and there's no, absolutely. A lot's changed since that time, but then it's still kind of still broadening the adoption. And after it sort of became focused on multi-party compute, then one of the areas that you're very involved with was the launch of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, and then out of that as well, you had the Token Taxonomy Initiative, and I think the tokenization idea as well, that's something that's really been on your radar for many years, and you've spent a lot of time thinking about that. So where did all of that come from, and where do you think we are as well with respect to this broader notion of tokenization?
I think a lot of it had to do with the times. We had done a lot of work working on different multi-party computing possibilities, like with confidential computing, with distributed ledgers, and what the combinations would be, what are the compelling use cases, and spending time with you in London, working on some of these early prototypes of trying to figure out how we use confidential computing with distributed ledgers to increase the capability of running your code, and how you tackle performance and privacy and things like that. And it was during those times when we were talking a lot about smart contracts, and we started saying, we kind of skipped over the whole tokenization thing and went straight to sort of smart contracts as being this the real treasure of distributed ledgers. And I was like, what, there's this whole tokenization thing we seem to have passed over, and I think that's when we started talking about sort of the distinction between a token and a smart contract was blurry, and I was like, that's not right. We should probably figure out how we logically describe tokens as their own thing, and contracts as things that manipulate the tokens, and tokens being decoupled from smart contracts so that they're not don't have these tight dependencies, and you can move them between contracts. And that's when the idea of Token Taxonomy Framework came out, and I think it was and we had started just educating customers, and it was repeating the same teaching, every time I was with, doing executive briefings and talking about what's the difference between a token and a smart contract, and I would describe, tokens in the real world, like, everyone's familiar with money, like physical currency, and what makes it unique. It's like the serial number, the denomination of it, and we all know that. Well, you can take any denomination and you can subdivide it into smaller portions. So there's these, like, it has these behaviors, and then it will have properties like the serial number, and then that's where the notion of, is there a way for us to back away from implementations to describe tokens and educate people on tokens using real world things, like how does a credit card behave, or how does physical currency behave, how does a loyalty point behave, things that people are familiar with, they're surrounded by tokens. It was the interesting that, so anyway, the token taxonomy sort of spun out of that, was an education framework. First, just to do education, and it was more about how can you design the thing? How can you let a business person describe a token business use case, and design their own tokens? And that's where the token taxonomy came out with. And I spent a holiday break in 2018 just writing it up, using some of the stuff that actually you and I had worked on in London, and came up, and you actually helped a lot with the syntax, and helping us try to figure out how we make this thing a composition framework for composing tokens. And that's where the token taxonomy came from. And then we were in a EEA meeting, and I think it was in Lisbon, Portugal, and I brought it up with a couple of folks there, and they're like, "Hey, that's a good idea." And I said, "Well, it's really not an Ethereum thing. It's independent." And that's where the notion of the Token Taxonomy Initiative came out. And then that turned into the Interwork Alliance, which then got consumed by the GBBC, and it continues on to this day. In fact, they're still working on the TTF and refining it through use cases and improving it. Even this week, I spent probably a good 3 or 4 hours, updating sort of our sustainability use cases in the TTF.
Well, I think it's certainly fair to say, with the amount of thought that you've spent on the subject of tokens, especially when we're talking about 2018, it's like, as we go into 2022, certainly the sentiment towards the end of last year was that you had prominent people like Chris Dixon of A16Z saying, with Web3, the token is the equivalent to the website in Web 1.0, and so off the back of NFTs and the kind of much broader sort of adoption, the whole tokenization narrative is starting to get a lot more traction. I mean, of course, we'd seen it anyway for years with regards to protocols launching their own utility tokens, and NFTs have been around for a while, but it's only really now they've started to, in this last 6 to 12 months, they've really caught on. And so, it's an area that you've been so focused on for so many years now, and hopefully now's the time where more and more people start to wake up and see how important it is to think about these sorts of properties and behaviors of tokens, so that you can actually formalize their definitions in something that's more general purpose in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole idea. Is I think tokens are, anytime you're doing anything in a multi-party way, it's sort of a part of the DNA of anything that you want to define. Is what is that shared value? Even if it's an ephemeral value of passing state between two parties in a workflow, there's value in defining what sort of state are you recording, or what's that value being passed. And do it in a way that's implementation neutral, which was the other thing. Is everything was focused on implementations, which I think you started overloading the industry with acronyms around ERC20s and 751s and 777s, and it was just like, it goes over people's heads, and they start to dismiss it because it's too confusing. And it's like, can we, make this thing approachable? And, you know, anytime you start putting enough meat on something, it starts to become daunting. As the more and more your documentation becomes, it becomes this. So we're spending a good bit of time now is sort of backing up and trying to explain what tokenization is in a repeatable way that you don't have to sit down and read 20 pages of even business level stuff, right? You can, and we made a couple of short videos, remember, the token explainer videos using the chalkboarding stuff, and I tried to explain those, and I still see people watching those today. Keep forgetting it. We should probably update some of those, but it's been worthwhile. I think to see where tokenization is now, and people dropping the term NFT in primetime television. I was watching a show last night, and someone was dropping NFT, and I was like, it's in a sitcom too. And it's like, I was like, man, okay, we've come a long way. And that's the interesting part too, is how the culture picks it up as well.
Yeah, and that sort of broader cultural acceptance of the whole concept, though, certainly is going to help everyone level up more and more with the idea of what it is. But I guess now they've kind of got to move beyond this idea of just NFTs around like being JPEGs or profile pictures and so on. But it's thinking about how you can actually quantify, say, business related assets, or just assets more, generally, whether it's, say, types of agreements or emissions offsets, and all these sorts of things too. And hopefully this is it's going to become much more of a thing now that you kind of have that base level of understanding throughout a significant portion of the population.
Yeah.
And so more recently, in the last sort of last couple of years or thereabouts, you've been focused much more on the ESG sector within Microsoft, and Microsoft as well. They've been very public with respect to their commitments around sustainability. Forgive me if I get this wrong, but it's was it by 2030 they'll be carbon neutral, and then by 2050, is it that they want to have erased all emissions that they've ever created as a company?
Yes, 2030 will be carbon negative. Yeah. So our effective emissions will be negative, and 2050 is that Terminator goal where we're going to eliminate all of our historical carbon from the 70s onward. And yeah, that's our commitment on carbon. We've had commitments in other areas around water and the other SDGs. Sorry, that's dropping lots of acronyms there, but yeah, I mean that was the thing that it's like 2 years ago. It's actually, that was a 2020 commitment, and we were making that transition in engineering from having done a lot of prototyping with multiple distributed ledgers and non-distributed ledgers, just ledgering for different use cases. The whole notion of a trusted ledger and the different optimizations you can make for different use cases. We had lots of experience there, as well as with confidential computing using enclaves or trusted execution environments in different scenarios. Like for the Confidential Consortium Framework, which we released in 2019, we're continuing to work on that, which is a very interesting bit of technology that lets you do decentralization. It separates decentralization of data from the governance. So you can sort of decentralize as much and sort of move the optimization of how decentralized your data needs to be and how decentralized your governance needs to be, and to optimize it for performance, regulatory constraints, and whole bunch of things that you could do. It's a very interesting thing, but we were saying, we don't want to just throw this platform out there and all these things. Let's find a use case that's real world and not make the mistake of throwing something out, because we've done you could throw lots of platforms out there without a use case, and you just don't know what kind of traction you're going to get or how well it's going to work until you actually build something with it. So when the team went out and made these commitments to to get to a negative position, the thing they did is, this is a non-technical team, and they ran the numbers on where our emissions were, where we needed to get to, and most of our emissions come from scope 3. And I don't want to get too much into emissions accounting, but that's essentially emissions you inherit upstream from your supply chain. It's a general way to put it. And so it's hard to directly influence those. Like, I can't, make my building more energy efficient and lower my scope 3 because, I'm buying lots of computer equipment and my data centers. And so, to be able to, one of the actions you do is, in general, is to say, hey, let's reduce your emissions that you can control as much as possible. That's priority number one. And then the second thing you should do is then offset the emissions that you cannot directly affect by purchasing, carbon credits and spending them or retiring them to reduce your emissions, or effective emissions. So it's taking the credit, retiring it, and essentially lowers your effective emissions to get you to a net zero position. So to get the net negative, we did the math and said, okay, we can't get to a negative position by just buying reductions, carbon credits that are reductions, which is the vast, vast majority of carbon credits in the voluntary market are these emissions reduction credits. We said there's just not enough supply, and until you start removing, you can't get to a negative number. So we said we're going to shift all of our purchases of carbon credits from reductions to removals. And they went out to try to source them and couldn't find enough removals in any market anywhere to satisfy our buying needs alone, which we needed to buy.
So in that context, the actual removals versus reductions, to give some tangible examples of what they could be on the other side, just for people who aren't as familiar.
Right. So a removal is like, hey, I switched my coal-fired power plant to natural gas, and you'll get credits for switching from less polluting to a less polluting scenario. Or removal is like, hey, I'm sequestering carbon using either nature-based solutions like sequestering it in forestry or soil or other sort of biological processes, or technology like direct air capture, sucking it out of the air and storing it in liquefied form into geological structures under the ground. I mean, there's so much innovation that can happen of how do I remove carbon from the atmosphere. And it's not just carbon, it's carbon equivalency, so it's any greenhouse gas as well. So, anything you're removing and storing it. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff around how long it's stored for. So nature-based solutions don't have a long, what we call durability. It's like a forest fire, or you harvest, in the soil, if you're capturing carbon in soil and somebody tills up the land, it releases carbon back in the atmosphere. And so there's a whole bunch of things in carbon removal that has to be done. But that's the difference between the two. And the removal is, hey, the thing that you want to look at for removal is, removing it from the atmosphere and then durably storing it so it doesn't get re-released. Now, some of it you can't help in nature-based solutions. It doesn't mean you shouldn't still do them. Those still have lots of value, because there's the natural cycles that you'll reduce carbon by replanting trees. When you're harvesting, lumber, there's a whole way of doing that in a way that you're actually doing, removing more carbon than you're releasing. Anyway, so that was the big thing is we were saying, let's go buy credits that are issued to people that are actually doing projects that are removing carbon from the atmosphere. And we couldn't find enough of them in the markets. And then the thing is, we couldn't find enough verified ones. We could find lots of sort of, hey, I removed this much carbon. And it's like, well, who verified that? It's like, well, we did. And it's like, okay, yeah. Where's the evidence? How do I know you didn't cook the books? I don't, you're printing your own money, man. Let's not try to sell me those things. So that was when we got involved and said, hey, this this market is nascent. It is a multi-party complex ecosystem that has lacks trust. So it sort of checked all the boxes of, hey, here's a great use case for us to go out and figure this out and do, work, to help standardize these things. And we can use things like the Token Taxonomy Framework and the Interwork Alliance to first figure out what this process needs to be. Let's don't say how it works now. Let's say, how should it work in the future? Because carbon markets have been around for a while, since Kyoto, and they evolved for reasons that they operate the way they do for certain reasons. And it's because the tech was different, and the players were different, and you're figuring these things out. And it's unlikely you're always going to build something better the second time around, because you've learned what works, what doesn't work. And so we're sort of standing on the shoulders of giants. So we absolutely, wanted to get people's feedback as how did you do it this way? Why did you do it that way? But also hear from them, if you would do it differently, how would you do it now? And we did a lot of that in the Interwork Alliance, and first just documented that life cycle process, cradle to grave. How does a carbon removal credit, how should it be created? What's that process? Who are the parties involved? What are their roles? And then what are those artifacts, essentially the tokens that they're going to pass between each other in that life cycle? And what are the contracts that are going to be in place to drive that process? And that's what we largely did. And the Interwork Alliance was in a technology neutral way. I mean, literally we're using PowerPoints and, using smart art, to create sort of hierarchical, real simple data diagrams to say, this is what data is really crucial to capture when you're creating a claim of carbon removal. What's that data? And anyway, so we did that, and then we started running experiments with different technology partners and people in that ecosystem to prove those things out. And we actually published an article at COP26 this year describing different phases of that life cycle, where we applied the Token Taxonomy Framework, the Interwork Alliance sort of contracting notions and implementations, just to run, again, we weren't focused on the implementation, but let's lay it out in technology. Sometimes we use just regular databases, right? And we use standard human-based workflow. It wasn't about, hey, let's do a hackathon and see which blockchain is the best blockchain for this part of the life cycle. That wasn't the point. The point was, can we actually do an implementation of this and do it with like off-the-shelf technology, nothing exotic, and just prove that out. And that was what we did, for the COP26 stuff, is say, let's build this out. And then that really informs us for saying, okay, if we're going to build this out, using sort of next generation tech, we have a much better validation of the use case, the data that we need to collect, who the players are, and what does that infrastructure need to, have functional and non-functional requirements. And that's really key if you're going to build something and invest like we would invest in at Microsoft and our partners. And it's all about, no one person is going to build a platform that's going to solve this problem. I don't think any one platform can solve the entire lifecycle cradle to grave. It's a network of networks to get this whole ecosystem to work. The key point there is the tokens that you pass between these networks, having a common understanding and language and schema for those things is super, super important. And that's where the TTF really shines, is saying, hey, let's come up with a spec, an open specification that you can go then implement in different platforms. And when we bring them together, they should integrate pretty nicely together and play well together. So that's been exciting over the last 2 years. And we continue that work to this day. And we'll have more to talk about, in next year or later this year. It's already 2022. So we'll see more about that. And as we progress and working with our partners in the voluntary ecological market space.
And so in terms of course, there's, you know, at one level you have the ambitions that Microsoft has, you know, for itself there in terms of its footprint, so to speak. But then, you know, more broadly, how do you envisage the sort of end state for the networks? Is it that there'll be these common standards that drive a number of interconnected networks that, you know, many large corporates end up using to offset their, you know, carbon and other related footprints?
Yeah, we sort of broke it up into two sides. One is, you know, the first problem to solve is um, we had to go fix the supply problem. How do we create um, more verified carbon removal supply, carbon credits that are based on removals? How do we do that? And how do we make it where it's scalable? Um, and also encourage innovation. So we looked at, you know, what are the aspects that a distributed ledger could provide, and what are those common ingredients um, that an ecosystem could build up on, just to create, the sole purpose of it is just to create carbon credits. Don't figure out how they're traded. Don't tell me how you're going to distribute them. Just how you're going to create them so that they're highly trusted and also not siloed. Today, if you look at carbon credits, are siloed in registries that don't talk to each other directly. It becomes a double spend, double credit sort of. Not that a lot of it goes on, but just the suspicion that it could happen is not good for the trust in these to scale these things out. We have to keep people from standing up walled gardens of supply, because it makes discovery and distribution very difficult. So the thing we think is very helpful is to have a common set of rails or a common network for the creation of verified supply and consistent supply, so that you can put two carbon credits side by side from different issuers and different projects and compare them meaningfully, right? And understand what the durability rating is of one versus the other, why it's different. And allow them to be, you know, bundled and pooled and a whole bunch of other things. And the way to get to that point is to have supply created in a consistent way with common schema and common attributes, but still allow differentiation. But, you know, you still have to, you know, lay that stuff out. And then the other side is the distribution side. Is then once you have that supply, how are you going to take it to market? And you see lots of marketplaces and exchanges standing up, and that's for a certain segment, right? You'll have a certain category of buyers that will look to go to an exchange or to a specific marketplace. We think like large corporates will probably go through corporate commercial banks, because they're already doing portfolio management, asset management. They've already been KYC. They have their cash accounts, so they can do settlement. I mean, custodial services, a whole range of services that corporates will want. We think that's a logical distribution channel, and there's lots of primary, secondary market opportunities there working the exchanges. But then there's that whole, why can't we use a distribution to consumer-facing point of sale, right? Can I get to a point where I can go to a large retailer and roll my transaction to the nearest whole dollar or euro number and say I want to apply that to carbon removal, and that was like micro transactions of carbon removals. So that's a different distribution model. So we think decoupling the creation of supply and then having multiple distribution models, which could be, why can't you do sort of DeFi around that? That's a perfect use case. If you have supply created consistently, you could go out, purchase credits and DeFi, put them in a pool, and run a DeFi. The thing that you have to understand about that is the retirement. These credits are ultimately meant to be retired, and that retirement has to go back through. And for the accounting to work, you have to know who retired it, so who can make that claim of carbon removal and apply it to their emissions. So you have to make sure that if you put this in a big pool and people are thinking they're retiring and getting credit for those things, they're not necessarily getting that. So there's things that you have to do and be aware of, and we're making sure we sort of highlight those things to allow these different distribution models to innovate, but also, remember the main purpose of this is to lower the carbon, reward and route financing to projects that are removing carbon, and also allowing the purchaser and the retirer of that asset to be able to then take the credit or make that claim and have that verified and attested by independent third parties, so that we don't have this double crediting and double spending problem. So those are the main concepts there that we're thinking about. Is the supply and the distribution of demand will be different depending on who the buyer is.
And in order to sort of realize that, in the context of the different chain networks, do you envisage that these the verified supply, these public networks, will ultimately be the places where they live because of the transparency there, so that then when an organization purchases any, say, down the line, there's that end-to-end traceability. There's no sort of ambiguity in terms of where these offsets or credits have come from.
Yeah, the credits could come from one network, and then you just allow encumberment and bridging of a token on a different network to lock that token, and you clearly have that bridge over to like an Ethereum, to the Ethereum network, and it's clear to see that carbon credit has been encumbered and is now represented as these tokens on this other network. When those tokens on the other network get retired, they flow back to the original credit that then flows back to retirement, and we can make sure that end-to-end process operates. So yeah, I think these public networks, and it could be a public, various different networks doing that, single encumberment and having that correlation and track and trace across those networks should be pretty straightforward.
And is it something that you envisage that they might start to pop up more in, we're talking the next year or two, or probably longer periods of time before we get to that sort of place?
I think you'll see some in the next year. I still think the corporate market's where the money is going to be. I mean, that's where corporates are under pressure to do this. I think you'll see the interesting aspect of some of these products being bundled with other goods, right? So being able to attach carbon removal to purchase of an NFT, could be so you could have a zero carbon footprint NFT, or just another asset that's being traded and tokenized on the network itself. You could attach this other token as a, we're already seeing that in energy markets where you have like carbon differentiated natural gas and things like that. So I think we'll see lots of innovation there. And looking at, doing it, make your gameplay zero carbon as you're playing some online game. You can do that kind of stuff. That will take longer to get to those distribution models worked out. The simpler distribution models are ones that are the most mature, going to these exchanges and marketplaces where corporate buyers are going through, and there's strong KYC, AML, anti-terrorism stuff already in place, and you're going to run afoul of any regulatory constraints. But I think ultimately, to get this thing to scale, we want to have as many distribution channels as possible, while preserving that the carbon removal integrity and the retirement of those removals going to the right parties, and the right participants getting rewarded for the work. It's hard work to do this removal. It's hard work to verify these removals and to instill this trust. You can't take shortcuts in the creation of supply, and that's the most tempting thing people look for. So they look for a shortcut to how can I suddenly create a whole bunch of carbon credits. And those shortcuts are going to undercut the market. We have to be very diligent and make sure that we apply the right kind of rigor here, and make sure the infrastructure sort of has those collection of evidence, tamper resistance, chain of custody, high levels of trust before you get to even. Let's not talk about trading assets. Let's not talk about they said, let's talk about getting that done right at scale first. Let's solve that first. The exchange in the marketplace stuff, that's kind of the easy part. That's the stuff we know. Lots of people know how to do that, and there's lots of opportunity there. But I think we're putting the cart before the horse if we do that.
Yeah, and that's sort of tying in, and again, just for for our listeners, it's more around the MRV process, which is where these I know, say you've got an organization planting trees and being able to prove that those trees were actually planted and that system wasn't being gamed in order to do it, and these sorts of areas. So as you say, that's kind of where people should be investing their time, because that's what's going to create this kind of more bulletproof foundation for all of the for the broader ecosystem to actually play out properly.
Yeah, that's right.
And so outside of the world of your current work with ESG, are there any other areas of, I guess, Web3 generally that you're excited about or seeing that have been surprising, or anything else there?
I think there's a huge, everyone talking about metaverse and all these types of things. It was one of the first things that we talked about was, and you get into these virtual worlds, we're talking about intangible assets of carbon credits and carbon removal credits and tokenizing those things. It's like you go into these games, and we've seen this in Linden Labs, and, people creating digital real estate and in-game, things that you can sell, and NFTs, and even fungible currencies, to spend across. And the big problem is those currencies aren't good across gaming universes. So I think the next thing I'm not in our gaming division, but if we look at the opportunity, wouldn't it be cool if you could, have an asset in one gaming universe, or have currency in one gaming universe and go to another game, and that asset's still valid and you could use it or barter with it, or interesting scenarios like that, where talk about creating a whole new ecosystem and digital value that mirrors the real world is very interesting, and that's something I've toyed with a bit. And I think the intersection of the metaverse, and kind of hate using that term, but it sounds so cheesy. But that's going to be a big intersection of distributed ledgers, public blockchains across these gaming universes, and we're seeing just scratching the surface of what you could do. And if you look at using something like Token Taxonomy Framework, you can model tokens for any type of scenario. And you just have to give the tools and the ideas and put those in the hands of the people that have the ideas. Right now, there's that big obstacle of blockchain that gets in people's way, and they feel like they have to get deep in blockchain to really be able to design an effective token, which really you don't. You can have a surface level understanding, use a tool like the TTF, model a token, and then have it vetted, right? And you have a common framework to talk to anyone about, what's the right platform for this type of token? Is it a UTXO based system, or is it an account based Ethereum like smart contract based implementation? Or is it a combination, right? What would it be? And so I think that's going to be an exciting thing. Interested to see if those opportunities come up, and get involved in some of those.
Yeah, it'd definitely be good to see it starting to be picked up. Now is definitely the time for more and more people to start looking at it, especially with these business folk who are seeing NFTs and saying, how do we apply this stuff to our world? And there's a great building block there. And for people who do actually want to follow the TTF and get involved, is the best place for them to go to the GitHub page, or is it via the Interwork Alliance? What would you recommend?
Yeah, you can go to the GitHub page. There's a public, it's mostly just documentation and the artifacts that you can see to learn about the TTF. on GitHub. The Interwork Alliance is, if you want to get involved, to go to interwork.org, and you can get involved with the TTF there. That's where you get, as a member of the Interwork Alliance under GBBC, you get the full framework to be able to update it and make modifications, because we drive that through work group processes and make updates. But there's still the public version that most people is all they need, right? But if you're looking to define something with a whole bunch of other parties, the forum to do that is the Interwork Alliance.
And if people want to just follow you more generally, what are kind of the best ways to do that? Is it LinkedIn, Twitter?
Yeah, I've really cut back on my social broadcasting. I'm not much into that anymore, but LinkedIn is probably the best place. Is where I am publishing information. I do like Medium as well. I've been more of a consumer of Medium, as I haven't done much publishing in the last year and a half, but we'll probably kick that up as well. But right now LinkedIn is, being a good Microsoft employee, is routing my stuff through LinkedIn is where I'm going right now.
Oh, good stuff. Well, Marley, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you today.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Cool. And we'll speak again soon, no doubt. Cheers.
Yes. Thanks.
Hi, it's Conor Svensson here again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'm really excited to share with you that I've written a book, The Blockchain Innovators Handbook, a leader's guide to understanding, adopting and succeeding with this disruptive technology. I've been wanting to share my learnings about blockchain and Web3 for a number of years with a wider audience, and I'm really excited that I can do this now. This book covers everything from the fundamentals of the technology through to opportunity identification and implementation for your business to ensure that you can be one of the big beneficiaries of the wider transition to Web3 that's taking place now. The book is available in physical as well as digital form. For more information, head to web3labs.com/innovators.